So we talked a little bit about open-ended problem solving and closed-ended problem solving, and how games shape them at being very good at analytical thinking with a defined solution. So they're very good at things like puzzles, where you sort of have a particular sandbox to work in, and a gamer's really good at figuring out how to get from point A to point Z if you show them where point A is and if you show them where point Z is. They struggle with open-ended problem solving, which is a problem that you kind of don't know where the endpoint is. For example, finding a job, like how do you know if the job that you found is good enough? Could you find a job that paid you a little bit more? Could you find a job that had a better boss? Like, how do you know when that ends? How do you beat the game of finding a job? Because you don't really know what the endpoint is. A lot of gamers think that the reason they struggle with open-ended problems like finding a job or finding a girlfriend is because you guys think you're lazy. And if you weren't lazy, then everything would be easier in life, and you're just someone who drew the short straw, and you're lazy. That's actually not the case. In my experience, there are some kinds of people, other groups of people that struggle with open-ended problem solving, and there's a particular group that is very smart and not lazy at all, but still struggles with open-ended problem solving. And that group actually happens to be doctors. Crazy, I know. But in order to understand how a doctor and why a doctor struggles with open-ended problem solving, we have to track back to the mind of like the 15-year-old kid who decides that they want to be a doctor. So you've got this 15-year-old kid who's at a Christmas party that they're at their family friends have a Christmas party, and they're going there, and they see someone that they haven't seen in a year, and that adult asks them, what do you want to be when you grow up? And then that kid says, I want to be a surgeon. And then everyone's like so impressed. They're like, oh my God, like you're going to be a surgeon. That's amazing. Like you're so smart. And the kid, just by telling people that you want to be a surgeon, somehow that makes the kid more respected. So the kid decides, I'm going to be a surgeon because everyone thinks that that's awesome, and I'm a good person, and I'm going to make a lot of money, and I'm going to perform surgery on people, and I'm going to save lives. And so what does that kid actually do? They go to their school counselor and they say, I want to be a doctor one day. And so the school counselor is like, okay, so you have to take a bunch of AP classes. You have to do really well on your SAT. Here's the Princeton Review or the Kaplan course that you should take. And so the kid sort of gets this script to how to be successful and how to get into a good college. So they study really hard. They take the AP classes. They study for the SAT. They work really hard, and they kind of do everything that they're supposed to, and they end up with a good GPA, a good SAT score, and then they go and they talk to their school counselor, and the school counselor says, you should apply to Ivy League universities. You should apply to Harvard and Yale and Stanford and UCLA and UC Berkeley, and you should apply to all of these wonderful institutions like Cornell and Columbia. And so the kid goes to those websites and downloads all those applications and then fills out a bunch of applications and then writes a bunch of essays and then writes the school tells you what to write. They say, write 500 words about a challenge that you faced in your life. And it's all scripted. So they don't actually have to think about what they're doing because everything is laid out for them. So they get into college, and then when they're getting oriented as a freshman, they meet their academic advisor, and they tell their academic advisor, I want to become a doctor. And so the academic advisor tells them what to do. And they say, okay, you've got to take pre-med courses, you've got to take biology, you've got to take physics, you've got to take chemistry. In your third year of college, you have to take the medical college admissions test, which is like the SAT for medical school. And then you also need to do some kind of volunteering, you need to do some kind of leadership experience, you need to do some kind of research. So they once again get a script of A, B, C, D, E, F, and G of boxes they need to check. And they start plodding along, and they work really hard, and they do all of those different things, and then they apply to medical school. And the medical school invites them for an interview. And so the medical school tells the kid, okay, now that you've sent us all this paperwork, this application and these essays and things like that about why you want to be a doctor, come to our medical school on this day and make sure you wear a suit, and then we're going to ask you why you want to be a doctor. And then based on that and your MCAT scores and your GPA, we'll either accept you into our medical school or we won't. So the kid gets accepted to medical school. They go to medical school, and then once again, it's like you don't sign up for particular classes in med school, you sort of have to learn everything. So you go to class every day, and you study really hard, and you take a bunch of tests, and then you kind of do what you're told. And then third year of medical school rolls around, and that's when you start doing these things called rotations. So the first 2 years of medical school, you're kind of a student, you're sitting in a chair just like in college or in high school. But the last 2 years of medical school, you're actually working in a hospital. And so you're following doctors around, and you're doing things like learning how to tie sutures and learning how to give injections, and you're kind of in the hospital actually doing the work of a doctor. So they do that for a little while, and then after that, you do this thing called apply to residency. So after medical school is when you really learn how to be a doctor, and that's during residency. So you do different kinds of residency. There's a surgery residency, there's a psychiatry residency, that's the one that I did. I'm a psychiatrist. And so when you go, but once again, it's just like college applications or medical school applications. You fill out an application. I write an essay about why I want to be a psychiatrist or why I think that the field of psychiatry is exciting. And I didn't write about video game addiction back then because it wasn't really a thing and people didn't really know what that was. And it's even still sort of just becoming a thing, at least within the academic community. And so you end up sort of applying to residency, and then you interview, and then you get matched. There's a computer program that tells you where you end up going for residency. So you go to your residency and you train there for 4 years, and during residency they tell you, they're like, okay, so on day 1 you need to show up at this hospital at this time and work on this unit, and then on day 31 you're going to be on call overnight in the hospital, so you have to show up here and do this kind of work. So every step of the way they tell you exactly what to do. And then you finish residency. And most people finish residency somewhere between the ages of 30 and 35, depending on what you do, or 29 and 35. And that's when, just pause and think about this for a second, that's the first time that this person applies for a job. So like you have a 34-year-old guy who's like a neurosurgeon who has never applied for a job. Never applied for a job. He boarded the train, and the train has its tracks, and he just goes along the track, goes along the track, goes along the track, and then he gets off the track. And the guy has never applied for a job. So a lot of doctors actually struggle with like job negotiations. And a lot of doctors, the first couple of years after they finish medical school, get chronically underpaid because they actually don't know what they're worth. They feel embarrassed asking for more money. So they go to their chief, and their chief says, well, why don't you work here, or why don't you work here? And they apply for different jobs, but they actually don't know, like they've never worked anywhere. All they've ever done is fill out applications, take tests, go to class, and do exactly what they've been told to do. So doctors actually struggle a lot with like basic life skills, like paying taxes and stuff like that, because they haven't done that. I mean, you've got a 34-year-old guy who's, I mean, they have paid taxes, but you know, their taxes are really simple. They've never found a job. They've never thought about, you know, where they want to live or buying a house or anything like that. They're like hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. They've never had a paycheck. And that's a doctor. And if you ask a doctor, you know, how do you find a job? It's really hard for them. They really struggle with like negotiating and struggling with like finding benefits and like, you know, asking for paid parking, and all these like tiny things come up that cause doctors all kinds of grief. And it's not that they're smart. I mean, it's not that they're stupid, and it's not that they're lazy. It's that finding a job is a skill that you actually have to learn how to do. And if you don't do it until you're 34, you're not going to be good at it. It has nothing to do with being lazy or being stupid. It's a skill. It's a part of your brain that you've never had to use. So gamers are kind of the same way, because if you look at a game breaks down all of your problems for you. It gives you a script of this is level 1, and this is level 2, and this is level 3. And in order to unlock level 4, you have to beat levels 1, 2, and 3. But it's kind of like a very close-ended system. In medical school, and people who become doctors are kind of the same way. They just go from A to B to C to D. You know, you do high school, and then college, and then medical school, and then residency. It's like level 1, 2, 3, and 4, and each one has an application, and each one has an essay, and most of them have interviews. And so how is that different from a gamer? It's actually kind of the same thing. In both of these situations, you have problems which are very close-ended, and you're told what to do. So both of these populations actually struggle with kind of open-ended or abstract thinking. A lot of doctors also struggle with finding relationships, by the way, but that's kind of a separate issue. So now let's compare that a little bit with someone else who's, let's say, doesn't go to medical school, and let's look at how they get better at open-ended problem solving. So let's once again start with our 15-year-old kid, but this kid doesn't have aspirations to be a surgeon. So when they turn 16, you know, they're not quite sure what they want to do. they apply for their first job. And so how does a 16-year-old find a job? They probably like start working somewhere where they know someone who's working. So they have a friend who works at a car wash, and so they fill out an application and they end up getting a job at the car wash. Or they have an uncle who has like a, I don't know, like a paper supply company. And so they work at the paper supply company answering phones. Basically, the solution space for where they can find a job is basically kind of like what's already in front of them. If they know someone, they'll kind of apply for a job, or they'll be driving down the road and they see like a hiring sign at a restaurant, so they'll start to become a waiter, or they'll like fill out an application at a place like McDonald's, whatever. They sort of start to find a job in kind of a pretty narrow area. And then what happens is they apply to college. And so in college, there's also kind of a particular solution space because, you know, do you want to go to college? But this solution space grows a little bit bigger than finding your first job. So do you want to go to college in-state or out-of-state? Do you want to go to college, you know, do you want to go to a state school or a private school? Do you need to apply for scholarships? Do you need to go someplace where, do you need to kind of stay close to home because you can't afford an apartment so you can stay at home? So now there are a lot more, going to college becomes sort of this abstract problem that has a bunch of different variables, and people start to learn how to navigate those variables. And so that person goes to college as well. And now they have to think about, well, what do I want to major in? They haven't decided to become a doctor already at the age of 15. So they talk to their advisors and they're like, okay, I'm going to be like an undeclared major or unspecified major or something like that. And they have to figure out, okay, do I want to be an engineer, or do I want to study finance, or do I want to study philosophy or biology? And so they have to think about like what they want to be when they grow up. And that's kind of an abstract problem. And so they try it a little bit and they decide to pick something. And then when they finish college, they start looking for a job. And so that too becomes kind of like now the net is even wider. So do you want to work in the same town that you went to college? Because now you have more options because you're actually going to be getting a paycheck, so you don't have to live close to home. So now the number of things that you can do actually increases, and you have to think, do I want to work in the country or out of the country? Do I want to live in California or live in New York or stay in Texas? Do I want to be close to family? Where do I want to live? What kind of job do I want to find? And so they start the job hunting process, and then they end up getting a job, and let's say they went to the University of Texas at Austin and they decide they want to move out west to California. And so they go to California, and then after a couple of years later, let's say they ended up working in finance, they decide that they want to go back to school and they want to get their MBA. And so once again, they're kind of faced with this question of, when do I want to get my MBA? Do I want to get it after 2 years or 3 years or 4 years? And do they want to take the promotion, or do they want to go to business school? So these problems become more and more abstract. And let's say that they go to business school, and then after they leave business school, do they want to go back to the old company, or do they want to move to a new company? Do they want to move out of finance into, let's say, investment banking or private equity or marketing, or do they want to work in the startup world? So these are all really abstract problems. But in the case of this last person that we're talking about, you can kind of see at each step of the way the number of variables they have to deal with grow. 16-year-old finding a job has like 10 options. Applying to college has like 20 options. Choosing what to major in also has like 10 options. Where you first find a job has like 50 options. When you decide to go to graduate school has like 100 options. And so at each step of the way, this person, their brain is actually learning this skill of taking an abstract problem and breaking it down into individual pieces. And so this person, when a gamer looks at the person who's successful and 30 in their age and says, wow, that person is like motivated because they now are a manager at an investment bank, they look at that and they say, that guy's got to be smart and he's not lazy. But it's more subtle than that. It's not that they're lazy or not lazy. It's that they have learned how to manage this broader and broader set of abstract problems and have gotten better at open-ended problem solving. Whereas the guy who's a gamer, instead of getting a job at 16, he plays video games for 6 hours a day. When he goes to college, he doesn't spend a whole lot of time going to different club activities and figuring out what to major in. He just picks computer science or like graphic design because he wants to be a video game programmer. He spends a lot of his free time just playing video games. When he finishes college, he applies for a narrower set of jobs and spends most of his time just playing video games. When he may not even go to grad school, because at that point he's sort of like, his abstract thinking stops. It stops growing. And so then he ends up being 30 years old and comparing himself to his buddy who's a manager in an investment bank, and he says, wow, that guy's really hardworking and I'm lazy, and that's the reason I am where I am. The fascinating thing is that's just not true. It just isn't true. It's not about laziness. It's not about intelligence. It's about developing a particular cognitive skill of taking an open-ended abstract problem and being able to chunk it up. And what I've found when I work with gamers, when I work with you guys, is that if we can sit down and actually do this, consciously take a problem that you have and operationalize it, break it down into its component parts, and figure out what you need to do at each step of the way, then the gamer suddenly starts moving forward in life. They suddenly start getting better. They start becoming more financially independent. They find better jobs. They even find girlfriends. Because we talk a little bit about getting into shape and upgrading your wardrobe and figuring out what to, like getting rid of the fedora and then like shaving that neck beard that you've got. And like gamers start to like do better in life if we chunk down why they can't find a girlfriend. It's because of the fucking way you dress, and it's because of the way that you smell. And it's because you're so fucking socially awkward because you spend the whole day in front of a computer screen. So before you do that, you got to go and take an improv class. And once they take an improv class, they feel more comfortable socially. And they feel more comfortable around women, and then women don't think that they're creepy because they know how to interact with women. And so even something like finding a girlfriend is like an abstract problem, but that can be chunked down into like fashion and hygiene and social skills and getting physically into shape and not living in your mom's fucking basement. Like that counts for a lot when you're trying to find a girlfriend. So you can break that down into pieces, and once you start working on the pieces, it's amazing how much better your life is going to get. But in order to do that, you have to learn how to actually break down that problem. Because your brain right now hasn't needed to do that. It hasn't needed to do it because you spend so many hours playing video games where that's been done for you. So one of the things that I invite you guys to think a little bit about is, do you actually know how to achieve the goal that you say you want? If you want to be financially independent, do you know the steps around doing that? And if you sit down and you start writing those steps on a piece of paper, I am almost certain that you're going to come up with like 6 or 7, which are going to be pretty abstract in and of themselves. And that's when you're going to stop, and that's when you're going to have trouble. And so what we need to do if you want to start moving forward in life is teach your brain how to take that abstract problem and turn it into a concrete one. Because the neat thing about gamers is if I give you a concrete problem and I give you a concrete set of tools, you'll figure it out on your own. So the first step is taking an open-ended problem and turning it into a closed-ended problem. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that. Any thoughts or questions?